Hello, everyone. We'll just allow a few more minutes so people can join in. So if you hold with us for 2 minutes, we'll start off in a second. Okay, I think we're good to start. So hello again, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for the third of 9 lectures on this virtual PhD course on urban economics in developing countries. This is co-hosted by the Bureau of Research and Economic Analysis of Development, BREAD, as well as the International Growth Center. We continue to be very impressed and excited about how big and diverse our cohort has been in the previous 2 lectures, with people joining us from all corners of the world, particularly from the global south, to learn more about this important and rapidly emerging area of economics research. So thank you very much again for joining us. My name is Juliana Oliveira Cunha. I'm a policy economist at the IGC City Network Initiative, and I'll be chairing today's lecture, which will be focusing on land use, markets, and planning, or the physical city as we're calling it, or my favorite topic ever. And to teach us something about this, we're very privileged to be joined today by 2 world-leading urban economists and scholars. So with us today is Professor Vernon Henderson, who's the School Professor of Economic Geography at the London School of Economics and Political Science. And we're also very fortunate to be joined by Professor Maisie Wong, who's an Associate Professor of Real Estate at the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. So thank you very much, Professors Henderson and Wong, for joining us today. So as in previous weeks, I just wanted to remind everyone about 1 or 2 housekeeping items before we start the lecture. So the lecture will be around 1 hour broadly, delivered by Vernon, then Maisie, and it will be followed by a 20 to 30-minute Q&A. So if anyone would like to act as a live participant during this lecture, meaning that you will have access to mic and video and can interact verbally during the Q&A, please do raise your hands, and Greg, our technical assistant with us here today, will randomly select a few of you to join the conversation. So for the other participants, please do type any questions you have in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And you can submit questions at any point during the discussion. And it would be great as well if you could include your name and affiliation as you write your question. And as a reminder, you can also upvote a question by clicking the thumbs up icon. I'd like to note that we're recording all lectures in this series, and the recordings will be made available on IGC's website, along with the slides and the reading list from the lecture as well. And then finally, just a reminder, for those who attend at least 7 lectures in this series, you will also be issued with certificates of completion by the end of the course. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Professor Henderson to lead off with the lecture. Thank you so much.
So thank you, Juliana. As was said, this is a lecture on land markets that Maisie and I are going to deliver, land markets in developing countries, with some focus, at least in my part, on the dynamics. So to give you a little perspective here, that in urban economics, the initial work focused just on developed countries. As such, all work assumed perfect institutions in land and capital markets. So in land markets, the assumption was that all land for firms and residents was privately owned with fully enforceable and transparent ownership and titling. That's clearly not the case in developing countries, and it's required us to reformulate some of our models. Second, most work is and was static, so there was no sense that in cities you were making irreversible investments in buildings with a life of many decades. and that in these fast-growing cities, there was going to be a lot of urban redevelopment, a lot of tearing down and building to higher heights, and a lot of motion, compared to developed countries where cities were much more static. The third issue, and this is a general issue that remains today, is that most work assumes no public land and no reason for urban planning. So even quantitative spatial models with congestion and so-called road investment have no land in them. Yet 40 to 50% of urban land, at least in developed countries, maybe 35 to 40%, depending on the city. In developing countries, is in public use. That's roads, sidewalks, public buildings, and the like, parks. An exception was there's an old literature from the 19th centuries trying to talk about the optimal amount of land to devote to roads as we approach the city center and land prices rise. That literature and notion was dropped years ago. So this talk, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about land use planning. Now, there's no modern economic literature that looks at, by economists, that looks at the overall planning of cities. The literature kind of cherry picks examples of bad regulations and their impacts, or an econometric literature trying to talk about how to identify the causal impact of regulations. What we're going to talk about is, first of all, just an example to show that planning matters. It has long-term effects. And then in relevance to developing country cities in particular today are these greenfield initiatives to help planning. I'm going to talk then a little bit about property rights. Macy's also going to talk a little bit about property rights. And then the last half, I'm going to talk about a dynamic model of cities with slums, a formal sector, and capital investment. So, land use planning. I've already said 40%, say, of land in cities in public use. You set up this transport network, the road network in particular, and that tends to drive the private demand for land in different locations. Who wants to live next to the highways or the main roads? Who wants to live nearby but not next to, and so on. Secondly, the rest of the land, in theory at least, is governed by regulations. And planners do this, not economists, and they have objectives like improving transport flows, grouping light uses to mitigate negative externalities, grouping what they call obnoxious uses like factories together away from residents, trying to be responsive to demand in the market, and to generally a sense that of regulation is to increase green space consumption because it's an externality. The tools they have are land use allocations, which say for each plot of land, how you can use it, residential, commercial, mixed use, industrial, whatever. And then a lot of regulations with minimum plot sizes, building footprint sizes, floor to area ratios, height restrictions, the idea that you don't want too tall buildings in certain contexts for whatever reasons the planners have in mind. So economists don't deal with this in a meaningful way in thinking about planning cities. So what I'm going to do is, first of all, I'm going to show you that planning matters. And this is based on a paper in sub-Saharan Africa where we look at 98 Francophone cities and 226 Anglophone cities. So these are cities with different colonial histories. In the Anglophone countries, land markets operated in cities in what was called a dual mandate. So there was the colonial section of the city that was a more formal sector, might have some degree of planning, although Anglophone cities did not have planning maps until the mid-20th century. The rest of the city, which was most of the city, the so-called native sections in those days, were unplanned. Francophone Africa was different. There was early plans starting in the beginning of the 20th century. Those plans covered the whole city, both sections. They envisioned a gridiron layout, meaning rectangular city blocks with four-way intersections to help traffic flows, and the notion that any expansion should involve contiguous uses. You shouldn't have leapfrogging and parts of the city that are just vacant. So we're going to examine the impact, or we examine in that paper, the impact of the colonial era planning on cities today. So that's planning that really colonial era ceased decades ago, and we're looking at cities today that have grown multifold since the end of the colonial era. And we're going to see those norms and the way they envision cities that persist to today. I mean, an enormous impact. So I'm going to give you a visual example. This is Accra, and this is Bamako. Bamako, as you can see, sorry, in the background in the gray is OpenStreetMaps about 2015. In the foreground, in the orange or red, is city maps from the mid-1960s for the two cities. So we can see here in Bamako that this is a very concentrated development. This gridiron structure of rectangular blocks with four-way intersections is maintained throughout. They're just starting then to expand across the river and to move out here into the west. But it's this very concentrated development. Accra is completely different. I mean, there's a little gridiron here and there, but it's kind of scattered development all over the place, big sections of the city that have yet to be developed and a lot of leapfrogging. So we then take this and look today and see that these Francophone cities compared to Anglophone ones, they have less land area for the same population, much higher density of development near the city center, less leapfrogging, less sprawl, and twice as much for the cities we're able to look at of this gridiron structure. So one strategy to correct for a lack of planning, as you can see in particularly the British cities, is to have, and many cities throughout the world, is to have what is called greenfield or de novo in the paper we're going to talk about urban planning. So this is to say, all right, the existing city, it's kind of a mess. We can't deal with that, but we're going to have these new areas that are well planned. So this historically starts with the World Bank finance sites and services projects during the 1960s, running up to the early 1990s, the tail end of it, where they set up titled and planned neighborhoods where people then self-built. So you got a plot with road access, it was titled, and the neighborhood was laid out. This was a program that operated in many countries, some listed here, and then a bunch of Latin American countries where there was also a big focus. I didn't break those out because there were so many. The program was abandoned in the late 1980s. The aspects persisted into the 1990s. They did it because there were poor repayment rates on the loans and the notion that this did not serve the poor, which was the original intention. So doing this, taking large tracts of land requires farmland at the city edge, as you can't assemble big tracts of land within the city. So the sites and services projects were on the city edge. They were in fast-growing cities, so 30 or 40 years later, these places that were once farmland have been overrun and are now in the main part of the city. Although the World Bank abandoned this program, a bunch of developing countries have persisted with it, and we're looking at an example in Tanzania, what's called the 20,000 plot project that was put into place between 2000 and 2005. It covers about 36,000 plots in Dar es Salaam alone. And at this point, it is not planned, but actually happening to massively scale this up throughout Tanzania. And then other countries are involved in this. So again, it's offer planning, property rights, and some infrastructure. So going back to sites and services, this paper by Guy Michaels and a bunch of co-authors in the Journal of Political Economy in 2001 evaluates the sites and services program that occurred in Tanzania. So this was in the 1970s and early 1980s, and now we're looking 40 years later. Utilities and roads were laid out, plots demarcated, title given, and then people self-built. At the same time that the sites and services were done in Tanzania, you also had other new developments that were just done privately or haphazardly. Next to the sites and services, we had existing slums that weren't upgraded, and then existing slums that were upgraded under a different World Bank and other programs. So the paper finds in general, but I'm going to look at some detail, that the sites and services are golden, that it really, these are premium places today. They're now more in the center of these cities as the cities have grown so much bigger. and they serve basically the rising middle class. They also find that in this comparing these slums that were upgraded versus not upgraded, that the graded slums are no better or even slightly worse than the other slums, and that's a topic that Macy's going to talk about in the context of Jakarta. So to give you a sense of what this greenfield planning is, this isn't from Sites and Services, this is from the Tanzanian project, but it's the same idea. You have in 2001 these greenfield areas here, this entire area, farmland, and then a portion of it becomes part of a 20,000 plot project, much bigger than shown here. And the red is the boundary, and this is the layout and the planned roads. And as you can see, this is the non-planned area. We then look 20 years later, and visually you can see that these plots layout is held. It's the same layout as planned, and that people have started to build dwellings in here. There are roads that access. This might have been a planned road that's now more of a footpath, but there's really pretty good access throughout here. Then you see next door the unplanned area, and it's a jumble, and there's no great road access. The buildings are crowded. There's not a planning. So comparing these areas overall, there's about a 70% premium on plots sold in these areas here in the planned areas. We think about 47% is due to titling and another 27% just the value of the planning. So going back to the Michaels paper, looking at Sites and Services from 4 or more decades ago, they grid the data. They cover 7 cities. They trace the buildings from satellite data, much like in the previous slide that you saw. They trace the neighborhoods. They know the building footprints. They know if the roof is painted. Painted roof's supposed to slow deterioration. And they also conducted a survey that gives more building information, heights, and utilities in a subsample of these sites. They then do what we call a spatial regression discontinuity analysis, where it's really focused on comparing the sites and service projects on greenfield land with a control, which is the bordering developments, much in like the slide you just saw, where there wasn't planning. And so what they do is they've gridded this data. They look at the grid squares within 500 meters of a boundary between sites and services and a control group, and run of a specification. So the key here is this is a dummy variable. If you're in the de novo in the sites and services, this is distance to the border from one side. This is if the distance effect differs on the sites and services side. This is a dummy variable, a set of dummy variables that groups together the sites and services projects with the surrounding control neighborhoods. So you're looking at this within variation in these local areas that have both sites and services and non-sites and services, and then a bunch of controls. And then they have a bunch of outcomes. So one outcome here is in this table here, a set of them. The main one is the footprint size of the buildings. Then there's the share of buildings with a painted roof, which does not have a significant effect in their work. They look at the orientation of buildings. So are they in the blocks parallel to each other, or are they kind of angles in more of a jumble with a higher value here, meaning great, more alignment, more parallel alignment, more, if you like, gridiron structure. And then a Z-score, which normalizes these three and adds them up into a Z index. And then they have the share of empty blocks and the share of built-up areas. So overall, in the sample from the satellite images in the sites and services, the buildings are bigger by about 11%. There's a big impact of having better orientation of the buildings. They're more oriented in a gridiron structure in the de novo or the sites and services, and there's fewer share of empty blocks and a greater built-up area. They then do their survey data, which has a lot more detail in 3 cities, Beira, Mwanza, and Tanga. And again, they look at the mean footprint, the share of, now they have the share of buildings with multiple stories. They have the share of buildings that are connected to electricity, a septic system, and then they have a value of the buildings controlling for the building characteristics and the plot characteristics, what's the premium from being in a sites and services project? So now here the footprint in the survey effects are much bigger. Share of multiple buildings is greater, but it's not significant. But a big impact of being connected to electricity, this coefficient compared to a mean here of it's almost like doubling or 50% increase in the amount of buildings connected to electricity. Similar effects for a septic system. This is the Z-score for all these 5. And then this big increase, 40 plus 45% increase in value. That's the price premium on these neighborhoods, and that's generated by this middle-class demand for these areas. So property rights, that's the second topic very briefly here. Ownership with informality carries a risk. It carries the risk that the landowner is going to lose the land and anything on it through encroachment, seizure by the government, invasion, deception. So for example, in Brazil, historically, land was sold with a bill of sale. You could sell your land twice, and there were 2 bills of sale, and then there'd be a big title dispute. So this lack of property rights inhibits redevelopment land into higher order use, because the more you invest in the land, that raises the risk of expropriation, because there's more to be expropriated, more incentive to try and take it from you. Moreover, it's really hard to get financing insurance. So economists take the view that you need full formality. So sort of to tease you here, I'm going to show you 2 cities. One is Nairobi, that we're going to focus on in a minute. 90% of the land in Nairobi is privately owned. And for residents, about 75% of them live on land where there is a private title, although they may be renters in most cases, but the land is privately owned. In Dar es Salaam, less than 10% of residential plots have a private title. So comparing these 2 cities, in Dar es Salaam, 85–90% of the buildings are under 4 meters. They're single story, whereas in Nairobi, that's under 40%. And then in Nairobi, you have much more buildings that are 2 to 3 stories or 3 to 5 stories and so on up the line. And visually, you just look at it here. This is the average height by grid square. This is Dar es Salaam. This is Nairobi, which you're going to see again in a minute. And you can see that mostly Dar es Salaam is just flat, except here for the center, whereas Nairobi has a lot more intense investment, a lot more height. And I mean, it's not proof it's private title, but it's certainly an association. All right. The last part of the talk, I'm going to talk about the dynamics. I'm going to have a kind of a macro view of a city, dynamics of building a fast-growing city like Nairobi. I'm going to do a monocentric city model compared to QSMs. I'm obviously simplifying the space, but that allows us to get into the dynamics. So the context here for these 2 papers, one in Science and one in the Review of Economic Studies, is that African cities are fast growing. That growth generates a demand for space that shifts up rent gradients. So rents in the cities rise, housing values rise. In a static model, that means you want to increase building heights to conserve on land, which is now more expensive. And you're going to densify because rents are higher, people consume smaller units in bigger cities, and they use less land in the construction of their units. The problem is that the capital in formal buildings is durable and non-malleable. So if you're going to densify, that means that you've got to really demolish existing buildings and reconstruct into taller buildings. And these construction decisions are based upon expectations about future rents. So this is a shot of Nairobi again. What's different here is, first of all, a little more detail. And secondly, that the slum areas that are defined without land rights are marked here in orange. They tend to be more on the city outskirts, which is an important point that we'll come to in a moment. This is the city center. There are essentially no slums left. There used to be more slums here, but the intense land values and opportunity cost of land has led a way to convert those to formal sector. And even out to 4 kilometers, there's very little. 4 kilometers here, you're starting to encroach on Kibera, which is one of the better known slums in Africa. And there's a lot of pressure here to develop Kibera. So this is a shot of Kibera that we took. This is Kibera with the slum sector with these corrugated iron sheet walls and roofs. And then this is the formal sector ringing it, really trying to impinge and come into Kibera. And of course, you see a bunch of school kids here. But this is really a hodgepodge that you see in many developing country cities. How to think about slums. There are two aspects. One is a technology issue. About 90% of formal housing in Nairobi is built with stone, brick, cement blocks. It's load bearing. It's not something you can rearrange. It's irreversible until it's demolished. The informal sector is built with corrugated iron sheets that you just saw in the picture, or a mud mixture. In Nairobi, 85% of the buildings in the slum sector under 4 meters. That means they're single story. In the formal sector, as you saw, there's huge buildings. New slum development, as I said, is on the city edge. That's because land is really cheap. And these informal sector buildings are land intensive. They've got no height. It's just what you cover with the space. And they're also, in some sense, movable. You could, in theory, unscrew these iron sheets, corrugated iron sheets, and move them, or they're short life because they're a mud mixture. The other is, but the one thing that you do see in Nairobi is there are slums at the city edge and private fully titled land, which we think is a transitional use that I'll talk about. Then there's a property right issue. The main part of converting land to formal use, obtaining clear title, that's a friction and a cost that has to be overcome. And secondly, there are issues with geography, particularly in Nairobi, with slopes and in water. And to sort of build a heavy building, you need to level that. That's an extra cost, and that tends to delay development. So we're going to do a model, or in the paper we do a model, and I'm just going to briefly talk about some of the results from it here, with landowners making investment decisions to maximize the present value of profits over the horizon. The profits are the annual flow of land rents. That's the value of the land. These cities are growing. In Nairobi, real housing prices are rising about 1% a year, the population at about 3%. So I've got a text here on what we think of the dynamics, but I'm going to do it in a picture. So this is a 3D picture. I normally don't do 3D pictures. I don't like them. But this is maybe an instructive one. So this axis here is building volume, which is really, in some sense, building heights. This here is distance from the city center, and this is time. So we think of Nairobi starting 1900 roughly, and we're looking then over the years as Nairobi develops, and we're thinking of different distances from the city center. So this here on this red arrow, this is a person who owns a plot of land 3 kilometers from the city center. At time 0, they're agricultural land. This is agricultural land. And then after 10 years, Nairobi starts to grow. It comes out and the edge of the city hits them, and they convert their farmland to slum use. And because that's what maximizes their profits, this cheap housing on the city edge that's very land intensive. And over time, as the city grows beyond them and land rents rise, they intensify the slum development by covering more of the ground, so there's less green space with these buildings. But at some point in the future, maybe 40 years later or something like that, the city's growing and prices are really high, and they say, well, the best way to provide a lot of housing is through formal sector. So they build their first formal sector building to a certain height. They hold it for a certain number of years. And then again, with the city growing and prices rising, at some point in the future, they said, God, I need an even taller building. So they tear this building down and they build another tall building. They hold it at that height for some years. And then in the future, at some point, they'll redevelop. Or from a different perspective, we could be looking today or a little bit in the future at this shining city there in the distance. And we're about 50 kilometers out, and we see a bunch of farmland, and then we see some slums, and then we see a row of housing. And as we get to or taller buildings. And then as we get towards the city center, we see even taller buildings. Okay, this is a computer-generated city. Cities don't really look like this. They look more perhaps something like this, a jumble. And so in this, there's kind of a stochastic element, the cost of obtaining title for each plot, overcoming poor geography that delays development. But in general, again, as we go over time, you have this intensification of investment, although now it's much more uneven. Or if you're looking today at this city here and looking towards the city center, you see some slums and then sort of some taller buildings and even taller buildings, but it's much more of a jumble. So we take this to the data. We have data for 2003, 4, and then 2015, about 11 and a half years apart. We use aerial photo data that's traced out. We have LiDAR data that gives us height. We have land price data scraped from the web. We have housing price data from a survey. We estimate we cover all parameters of the model, except the discount rate, which we take from the Bank of Kenya. So for example, we get land share in formal sector housing as being about 40%. That corresponds to estimates, say, for the United States. The informal is a much greater share because it's land intensive, about 75% of is land share in informal sector housing. I want to show you two graphs. These have to do with building heights. So these are buildings in the sample that are unchanged from 2003 going forward. And these are buildings that are redeveloped. The red is slums, and this is heights. So you can see that the slum buildings, the new and the old, are about the same height. In the formal sector, we see the unchanged buildings. There's this decline in height as you move away from the city center, and it does continue. It's very sharp here, but it does continue as you go out towards the city edge. That's the unchanged buildings. These are the new buildings, their height over an 11-year time period. So you're averaging over 11 years, and you can see, except here at the city center where there's very little new construction, as you'll see in a moment, you see a much higher buildings of these new buildings. In fact, when you tear a building down and you replace it just within a year period, as opposed to looking over 11 years, we estimate that the height triples. That's both in some data work that we do and something that comes out of the model. And generally, when new buildings have a bigger footprint because you increase your footprint when you build higher. The second graph here is the volume change by distance from the city center. And this is the percentage change in volume at each distance from the city center. And volume change is broken into two parts. One is net redevelopment. That's the volume in, this is literally volume, height times base, right? Cubic meters of space. This is net redevelopment, meaning what you put in place minus what you took away, what you tore down, the volume that was there. And then this is infill, where you're infilling grid squares that were green space before. Some of that comes from enlarging and tearing down an existing building and enlarging its footprint and expanding into a new grid square. What you see here is there's not much redevelopment or development at all in the city center. This was redeveloped about 30 years ago. And the big wave of redevelopment here is about 3 kilometers from the city center, where redevelopment alone is increasing volume by 30%, and the overall increase in volume is well over 40%. Here, you've torn down in that 11-year time period about 35% of buildings. If you did the rate for a developed country, it'd be trivial, like 6%, a tiny percent of that. And so you got this wave of redevelopment kind of predicted in the model. At some point, you're going to be redeveloping at the distance here. And then as you get further away from the city center, there's a lot more infill as you intensify the land use. So there is a welfare issue here. And that involves the older slums like Kibera that you saw near the city center. They're an extremely valuable land. We're building high, and formalizing would be optimal, but there's a lack of property rights. So I'm going to just divert for a moment. It may run me over a couple of minutes. The Kibera was a land grant to the Nubian King's Rifles for service for the British. It was a land grant made in 1911. It was 1,000 acres. At the time that it was granted, Kibera was far from the city center at 3 kilometers. And so the British gave them the land, but they didn't give them title. At independence, the new government revoked the Nubians' claims to the land and took over and said these are government-owned slums, not managed, not operated, just government-owned. The inhibition to redeveloping an area like Kibera is twofold. First of all, they're still the Nubians, and there's a moral claim to that land that is recognized in if you like, socially. Secondly, is that much of this land are rental units. They're operated and owned in quotation mark by government officials and politicians, the majority of them. These people have no ownership claim to the land. They're operating illegally. They pay bribes to do so, and it's a very profitable business. They're opposed to redevelopment because they're going to lose their profitable businesses because they got no real claims to the land. They're doing this through corruption. To give you a perspective here, at 3 or 4 kilometers from the city center, the value of land under a slum household, so I'm not doing it per meter, I'm looking at, say, the population of slum households here and dividing up what the land is worth if it were to remain in slums forever versus what would it be worth if it was converted to formal sector use. So the land under a slum household is worth about $10,000 to $11,000. This is in 2015. If it was converted to formal sector, it'd be worth about $27,000. That's an additional $16,000. That's a lot of surplus to play with. These tenants are paying about, at most, $600 to $700 a year in house rents. If you offered them 3,000, 5,000, whatever dollars of this surplus, the sense is in general they would be quite happy to move. But these landlords, these landlords, these illegal landlords are making money off of this, and they don't want this redevelopment. So how do you deal with this? So the situation is a corrupt mess. So I'm going to end on that note and turn it over to Macy.
All right, thank you very much, Vernon. You didn't tell me you're going to end with, I forgot to see that you're going to end with the situation is a corrupt mess, but I'm going to pivot to my part. But I did want to start by saying, though, that it is actually a big honor for me to be following Vernon. I didn't have a PhD course in urban and development, and reading Vernon's papers is really very much my PhD. Like Juliana, this is also my favorite topic ever. And so I just wanted to maybe I think for today, I'm going to focus on, 2 papers. And then at the end, talk a little bit about some other topics that are related to land markets and planning. And then definitely leave some time for questions. So the first paper I'm going to talk about is a paper with my colleague, Nina Harari, that's studying slum upgrading. This is a very large-scale slum upgrading program called Kampung Improvement Program, KIP. It was actually introduced in 1969 in Indonesia, focusing on the city of Jakarta. So in the 1960s, after the Dutch left Indonesia, a lot of people started to move into the city of Jakarta because when the Dutch was there, Jakarta was a closed city. So when the Dutch left, a lot of people started to move into the city of Jakarta. And so Jakarta was experiencing very massive flows of urbanization, not unlike today. And so the government saw a lot of new slums being formed with very minimal services. And so they wanted to improve neighborhood quality for those slums, which in Indonesian is called kampungs. And so this is the Kampung Improvement Program that is very famous for also being pretty large scale. So it covered 5 million beneficiaries, 25% of land of Jakarta. What did the program provide? What are the upgrades? So the upgrades were basic upgrades. You can see here, right? Jakarta is very famous for flooding. And so they improved the pathways, improved drainage canals, other investments as well, but very basic. And then importantly, it offered a 15-year verbal non-eviction guarantee. This is common, and it makes sense because the government wanted to say like, hey, we'll provide the public improvements, but we also want you to improve your own homes. And if the government didn't offer this non-eviction guarantee, then the slum residents will always be worried that they might be evicted at that time. And so they offered this as a bundle to also try to encourage private investments. KIP is a very famous program, and there are many studies that have established the short and medium run effects of KIP, including a World Bank study that showed that it improved the quality of lives for many ultra poor. It's very well executed. And this is a city, a map of the Jakarta city during the time of KIP. Fast forward to today, right, over time, across the 4 decades, this is now the city of Jakarta amidst a very large metropolitan area. And so our focus today is actually to focus on the long run impacts of upgrading. So now we are asking, now for the city of Jakarta that has experienced also urbanization, formalization, and modernization, what are the long run impacts of these upgraded neighborhoods? And so this is actually a picture I took, right? So this is a KIP neighborhood that is quite centrally located in the CBD of Jakarta. So our long run, we focus on this long run question that is related to this very important policy debate around, like we know that upgrading has short run or medium run direct improvements on people's lives and slum residents benefit. However, in the long run, is there this concern that making the slums attractive and the upgrades, right, will it make the slums persist longer than it otherwise should and then stay informal? And so when other non-upgraded neighborhoods start to formalize, right, might we see a reversal in outcomes? And so, of course, this slum residents being able to stay longer in upgraded neighborhoods is a good thing for the slum residents and could be an initial goal of the program. Our paper is focusing more on, from the social planner's point of view, in the long run, if upgrading does cause delayed formalization, so these upgraded neighborhoods stay informal longer, what is the welfare implication from the social planner's point of view? So that's the focus of the paper. And so a major contribution of the paper really is the data. It was nice that we roughly knew what the long run research question, what the question was, which was trying to figure out in the long run what happened to these KIP neighborhoods. So a key source of data we got was the policy maps from the Jakarta government that gave us very high resolution delineation of upgraded neighborhoods. These are these black polygons. And then the gray areas are historical maps we traced that told us places that were already kampongs before KIP. And so now we can also look at places that were kampongs before KIP and then upgraded versus not upgraded. So that's roughly the rough right-hand side of our research design, comparing KIP and non-KIP comparable areas. The main outcomes we were able to get were, first, assess land values. We don't have dynamics, so we only had one cross-section from 2015. We did also try to validate the assessed land values data with building heights. This we got from our own photographic database. And so a lack of data of slums is a major challenge in this topic area. So what we set about doing is we gridded the city of Jakarta with pixels, and then we randomly sampled about 20,000 pixels. Then for each of those pixels that we sampled, we downloaded photos either from Google Street View or we went to the field to collect it. Because some of these neighborhoods that you saw, right, from here, right, you can see some of these neighborhoods, they're too crowded and the roads are too narrow for Google's car to access. And so it was very important to also send our field team to take the photos so that we now have a balanced representative sample of formal and informal areas across Jakarta. So to summarize from the photos, right, we coded up the number of floors for the tallest building. And then we also coded up the degree of informality just from their appearance. We have a lot of other outcomes like parcel density, registration status that I'll bring up as they come. Just maybe one slide to summarize the takeaways before I go into the details. A key threat of this design is that some upgrading programs tend to target places with worse neighborhood quality. So this program selection bias is going to be a key problem. It makes sense from the program's perspective, right? Because we want to help neighborhoods that need help. And so it tends to target worse places, places that were very dense and also informal and kampungs to begin with. So we're going to have a lot of things, a lot of different types of research designs to try to address this issue. Because of the granularity of our policy map and also of our outcomes, we're actually able to compare slum and non-slum areas or KIP and non-KIP areas that are within a very small geographic unit. We also have other designs to try to assess program selection bias that I do not have time to get into. In a nutshell, okay, we find on average, KIP places today on average have lower land values and have 9% shorter buildings. We explore the heterogeneity across center, middle, and periphery, and we find very large effects within 5 kilometers of the CBD, and then it decays pretty sharply. We also find from our photos, right, that these places are informal and a variety of other informality outcomes like share of unregistered land parcels and parcel density. All of this is consistent with a delayed formalization story of upgraded slums. So slums stayed longer while the non-upgraded slums formalized. So just to deliver intuition for our research design, one of our research designs is the following, where we look at all the gray areas in that big map, right? So these are all kampungs that were there already before KIP. And then we compare places that were upgraded, so these black polygons, and places that were not upgraded. We also have boundary discontinuity design that compares observations that are just within 200 meters, which is quite small. So here, each square is a pixel, and blue pixels are formal, and red pixels are informal. And here, of course, I'm cherry picking some pictures to show you, and then later I'll show you regressions. But here, by and large, this is in fact what we see, which is that inside the polygon, so upgraded neighborhoods tend to stay informal with shorter buildings, whereas outside, even if it's just 200 meters outside, or kampungs that were, already kampung slums before KIP, but were not upgraded, these places are now more formal. So they have taller buildings and appear more formal by our photo index. Zooming out, this is now the entire city. This is a very nice feature of KIP is that it covered 25% of Jakarta's land. It's a very old program because we're examining it 4 decades later. So it's a very old program. And so actually a lot of the upgraded places, so a lot of the KIP neighborhoods are actually quite central because these were very early kampung settlements. And so the blue triangle here is the golden triangle, which is the CBD. And inside the CBD, there's still upgraded kampungs that are KIP. And here we've color coded it to be shorter versus taller buildings. So you can clearly see by today, right, in modern Jakarta, there is a CBD, okay? But upgraded places on average do have shorter buildings. And we do this now across this, all parts of KIP. So here's just a bin scatter to show you all of the data. And so here we also have a monocentric view, right, where we have distance to the city center. And on the left axis here, on the vertical axis here, we have land values. And then here we have number of floors. And you can see clearly from the bin scatter that KIP places, especially close to the city center, today on average, they have lower land values and shorter buildings. And most of the effects are actually concentrated in the center. This is a regression just to add a lot more controls because we still are worried about this major threat that KIP, the program, targeted informal areas that needed more help with lower neighborhood quality. And so in this regression, we control for 2000 Hamlet fixed effects, which are very small, comparable to census block groups. And we continue to see lower land values, especially in the center, particularly in terms of height, right, number of floors, we do see that it's a 13% reduction in height in KIP neighborhoods in the center, where the center is within 5 kilometers of the CBD. So those are all the reduced form main results. There's a lot of other results that I don't have time to go into, but I want to spend some time talking about the model and why we need a model. So I think the reduced form pieces results are transparent and shows on average what happened to KIP neighborhoods over the long term. However, it has a few things that are missing. For example, we'd love to be able to characterize welfare, also for high versus low skilled residents, because we know that there could be very big inequality effects. We are also worried that, what we're finding is just partial equilibrium from our BDD, boundary discontinuity, and it's not clear, how to think about general equilibrium effects. Like if we had a counterfactual where we didn't have KIP, there would be sorting, spatial linkages, spillovers, and having a model that has these pieces, right, will allow us to quantitatively assess the importance. So ultimately, the goal of the model is to allow us to characterize welfare from lifting KIP. And because KIP has such a wide geographic scope, and from the heterogeneous results here, right, we wanted to also explore, what if we had KIP in center only, middle, periphery, and we lifted KIP citywide, center only, middle only, or periphery. We only have one cross section of data, so we hunted very hard for historical data, but we couldn't get high quality historical data. And so we focus on a static model across different regions. How do we integrate the reduced form with the structural model? Here, we did want to discipline our structural model with reduced form. And so basically what we did is we construct these non-KIP regions. And then for each non-KIP region in the center, middle, and periphery, we construct a KIP counterpart that has the spirit of our identifying assumption, meaning we construct a KIP counterpart to the non-KIP places that give rise to wedges in land values and heights that match what we see in the reduced form. Because if we didn't have all these controls, right, we probably will find larger effects in land values, larger wedges in land values, and larger wedges in heights. But those wedges would then maybe be driven by unobserved selection bias or neighborhood quality. And so we try to construct, our goal is to discipline our counterfactual by constructing KIP counterparts where we back out wedges, right, in model fundamentals that will match the heterogeneous estimates in terms of wedges in KIP, non-KIP wedges in heights and land values. The model has many pieces and we spent a long time on it, but I just want to give you a flavor given the restricted time. So we wanted to definitely focus on high and low skilled residents because a big part of KIP is about, we remove these upgraded neighborhoods, the low skill will be displaced. They will lose access to the city center and they'll lose access to jobs, so they will be harmed. The high skill, of course, will benefit because now they can access formal housing and formal employment in the center. So we were inspired by Gector 780s, which is this next paper. So we built a model with two types of households, high and low skilled. And these households are choosing where to live and where to work. They are locations that are differentiated by a few main attributes: cost of living, which is rents, which includes land values and building heights, so space rents, amenities, and then we allow for spillovers like a standard gentrification model. So you get both high and low skill types benefit from spillovers from living close to high skilled. That's on the demand side. On the supply side, we have formal and informal housing, but it's not as rich as Vernon's paper, which has dynamics. So here we assume segmented formal and informal housing. Developers have to decide for each plot whether to do formal or informal housing, that's lambda, and then how tall to build. In our baseline case, we assume informal supply is inelastic, which is really not realistic, but this is just a baseline as a starting point, and then we have robustness to allow for elastic informal supply. and horizontal coverage that's fixed. So we have developers that have profits from developers have profits, informal profits, which is rents minus costs, times coverage, horizontal coverage, and formal profits, and they can choose formal or informal profits depending on the relative profitability. If they convert from informal to formal, then there will be a tax that they have to pay, which is our parameter to capture formalization costs. Then we solve the model, and the model has land markets, housing markets, location choice optimization, developer profit maximization. And so there's a lot of details in the paper. I'm going to skip through them, but all of these are the equilibrium conditions that allow us to use these numbers of equations, right, to back out and uncover the unknowns that we need. And then later, I'm going to show you a citywide welfare metric, which aggregates across high and low types. So G is for high and low types across the city. And this is the thing I was saying about backing out the wedges. So this is our reduced form exercise, where of course we worry that in the boundary discontinuity kind of analysis, we find a wedge, but that it doesn't really mean that once we lift KIP, so if there's no KIP here, and a KIP became like non-KIP, right? It doesn't mean that we will immediately get just those heights and land values, because then after that people can resort. There'll be spillovers, and so we do want to quantitatively assess when we write an equilibrium model whether there are direct effects that we can get we see from the reduced form exercise, but whether spatial linkages and spillover and resorting will maybe undo or reverse some of those direct effects. So that's kind of the idea of the paper, of the model. So I'm going to show you now counterfactuals that compare a counterfactual of with KIP and a counterfactual where we basically say make the KIP counterpart inherit the same model fundamentals as the KIP as the non-KIP counterpart. We do this citywide and as a benchmark first, and then we do this for the KIP places in the city center, the middle, and then the periphery. So this is the first welfare result which is very intuitive, where we said like comparing one counterfactual with KIP all over the city, mostly in the center, and then another counterfactual without KIP, where we allow the KIP counterpart to inherit the same fundamentals as the non-KIP. We do find something intuitive, right? That the high scale will benefit because now they can access city center. And the low scale, of course, will experience losses because they tend to be displaced away from the center. Then we do this exercise of like lifting KIP just in the city center, middle, and periphery. And we find this other main result, which is that a majority of the welfare gains, right, are attainable just from lifting KIP within 5 kilometers of the CBD, whereas actually outside of the CBD, so in the half of the program areas outside the city center, then there's minimal effects. So most of it is actually from KIP being prevalent in the center. We do a lot of other counterfactuals, like redeveloping KIP together with relaxing zoning, but I do not have time to go through this. The paper has a lot of other important caveats that I also do not have time to get to, because I do want to devote some time to the Mumbai Mills paper, because I very much see these two papers as companion papers, and we actually I feel like we grew up together in the last 7 years. And so let me just provide some context, right? So far, the Nairobi paper is very rich on the dynamic side. It really has this rich trade-off of comparing formal technology of supply and informal supply, whereas the Jakarta paper of KIP doesn't have those dynamics. We just don't have those data to discipline the dynamic part, so we are static. But we compare KIP and non-KIP in center, middle, and periphery regions. We have 2 types of households on the demand side. We do have also commuting. So households are able to choose place of work and place of residence, but we do not have firms, and we assume segmented housing. So formal and informal are segmented. The Mumbai paper is richer on several other dimensions. So from that context, let me talk about what the Mumbai paper does. So the Mumbai paper is studying this policy reform in central Mumbai that basically made it very easy to build high rises on empty textile mills. It also has a rich model of two types of households, high skilled and low skilled. It does importantly have a cross section, so two cross sections, so it can study movers over time. And they have this very nice way of inferring high versus low skill from names, using education from names. Okay. On the supply side, they have dynamic supply for the formal and an informal inelastic. This is a picture to show the zoning reform. So here the blue polygons are empty textile mills in 2000 before the reform. And the reform basically made it easier to build on the empty land. And so you can see here, right after the reform, that there were high rises built, residential towers and commercial. And they also explore spillovers. So that before there might be some slums right next to the empty textile mills. After high rises are built, this is like a classic gentrification picture, right? After high rises are built, land values of floor space value goes up. And then nearby areas are also gentrifying, right? So then slum residents are displaced. Some of them are evicted without compensation. And so their paper is going to explore a lot of those rich pieces of this important debate. They also have incredible data contribution, a lot of data contribution. So they importantly have assessed floor space values for 900 subzones from before and after the reform. So the reform was in 2001. From 1993 to 2013. So that allows them to do this very nice event study I'll show you. Another thing that's very nice is they have formal and informal establishments, which is rare. So they have formal and informal employment firms by digitizing 8,000 hand-drawn maps. They also have population data for wards, machine learning, satellite imagery. All of this is really to address this big gap, which is lack of data covering formal and informal. This is the main picture I want, main regression result. They have a lot more. Just to show you some headline results of this gentrification story, right? That sites that contain a mill, after the reform, you do see prices go up. Nearby prices go up as well. So this is the big spillover piece. Slum share goes down. So slum residents are displaced nearby as well. So informal employment goes down. They cannot detect any effects on formal employment. It's noisy. So it's I think that's one of the pieces that they did not detect. They do see high skill benefiting, and overall population density falls, right? So you see more high rises being built, but it's not enough. But slums also offer housing to a lot of people, like it's very dense. And so on net, in that context, they find that overall population density falls, which is in line with rich people consuming more space. Okay, here's an event study that's very nice with that time series data they have on land values. And they are able to show parallel trends before the reform and then gentrification, so prices going up after the reform. They have a very rich model that is very similar because we are very much inspired from their model. And so I'm just going to focus on a few pieces. So they have two types of housing, two types of residential demand. People are choosing where to work and income as well, so commuting and income. Importantly, they have a sector of firms with production. Firms are going to hire labor and use land for commercial development. And this actually introduces a nice mechanism where you can study, hiring, so place of work and place of living, and then the land allocation for commercial and residential space. So they have in their equilibrium, right? They have to solve for developer supply with formal and informal land use, formal housing supply, inelastic informal supply. They allow for dynamics so they can back up moving costs for high and low types. And they also see slums over time using the satellite imagery and some machine learning. They invoke the equilibrium conditions to help with identification and therefore estimation. They do also some a pretty elaborate indirect inference procedure, much elaborate, more elaborate than ours, but the same spirit of trying to back out parameters that match their reduced form estimates. Here's their punchline. So they do many welfare results, but one of the punchlines is that the reform, right, of course, benefited the high skills, similar to many gentrification papers. High skill benefit, so they have welfare gains. Low skill benefit as well, because they live closer to high skill and there's spillover benefits from access to jobs and living close to high skill. They also show distributional consequences. So the low informal who are evicted and not compensated, they suffer a lot of losses. And then they perform several counterfactuals to show how we can maybe help those compensate those who are evicted, but still, the city will not lose a lot of gains, total gains. Just to recap before I go into the other special topics, I wanted to maybe share now maybe the academic or perhaps nerdy reason why this is my favorite topic, right? I hope you see from our papers that this is a really important topic of land allocation. Within the topic of urbanization in cities, land is one of the most central resources of a city, and it affects where we put what, and they're very important questions like slum residents, urban development, land allocation that are, within this broad topic. So the nerdy reason for why I enjoy this topic, right, is because there are many interesting questions. I love to look for data and hunt for new data. And so this is a place where data is lacking, and contributing data for land use patterns, building heights, residents, workers, wages, all of this will be very incredibly valuable. It's also a place where, neighborhood quality or unobserved omitted variable biases is very important. So coming up with research designs, policy reforms is very useful. And of course, is a place where, it's a city, it's an urban system. So spatial equilibrium will be very important. So it's going to be a combination of data, research design, and also model and modeling. So I spend most of my time on the paper with Nina on slum upgrading and land markets in Jakarta. And then hopefully you see some important parallels with Gekter and Stevenidis for Mumbai, and also piggybacking off of a lot of what we've learned from Vernon's work as well. In the remaining time I do want to leave time for questions. I feel like we have to talk about a lot of these other work that's related to land and planning. And I'm going to mostly talk about titling programs. So Vernon talked about property rights and urban development. I want to focus on some other papers that are related to titling programs and improving property rights, and then housing policies, and then maybe some other topics as well. So there are many papers on titling. That's why the reading list is so long. So to summarize, right, here's how I read them, right? So there are important effects on titling programs. So we find important effects of titling on labor force participation, on housing investments. There are also other outcomes people care about, of course, satisfaction, private investments, and mental health. There's newer work also that look at willingness to pay by the poor for titles relative to fees. And of course, I have to also give a head tip to a lot of the important work. I check out the IGC website. I go there a lot. There's also a large-scale titling program in Thailand that is we have not looked at the long-term effects of those. Of course, within this literature on titling programs, right, there is this thinking about how gradualism or incremental approach might not be enough because of the fast pace of urbanization. So this might have a very slow progress because intermediate forms of titles are just not valued. Informal settlers also have tenure security, so eviction is politically risky in many places. And so that is one of those other trade-offs as we think about, the role of a title, especially if you already have tenure security and you have competing needs, so you don't have enough money to pay for the high fees. Housing is another topic that I have to just mention because it's so central to land allocation. Here are some of the papers about housing that you might want to look into if you're interested. there is very nice data about with a long-term panel of slums in Chile, and there's now very new work about the role of slums and offering housing, right? So slums and housing supply. There's of course also very important work about how if we clear slums and we displace slum residents, this is very harmful for children. And this is now very well documented in this paper. There's a bunch of papers about building housing, public housing, and relocating them far away is never a good idea. So there's a lot of papers to show this. Some lotteries show that relocating close by can be beneficial, but these tend to be small scale because central land is very lacking. And then privatization of housing and state misallocation in China is also a very well studied topic. There are a lot of other topics I don't have time to talk about, but so we've talked about tiling programs, housing policies. There are many other things that are important, like housing finance, collateral channel and asset price bubbles, zoning reforms. In Brazil, there are a lot of other papers, but this paper is a new one that summarizes this literature. Similarly, there's also a large body of work, growing body of work on property taxation and land. And these are some papers related to that might summarize so that you might want to get, I wanted to point you to if you're interested. So to wrap up, right, this is a very important topic, right? Land use and planning are very important to this bigger goal we have of how to make cities work to promote productive, inclusive, sustainable cities. This is an area where there are severe housing shortages, major challenges, and it is a really big area where we need a lot of more research to help us understand, how we can address these major challenges. Hopefully you've enjoyed seeing some of these recent papers with their data contributions and modeling approaches. And I invite you to, contribute more because we definitely need more research in this area. Okay, let me stop sharing. And thank you very much for your attention.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor Henderson and Wong. I really, really enjoyed your lectures. It was really great. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're now over to Q&A part of the lecture. So we have quite a few questions in the chat, but please continue to post them or upvote the ones that you feel or that you would want to get answered. We'll try our best to get to them. I will start off with 2 questions from the chat, but I'll ask those of you participating live or who wants to participate live to please raise your hands, and then we can bring you to the conversation as well after this. So starting with one question for Professor Henderson, is the persistence of historic roadblocks beneficial in itself, or could it be a constraint when driven by obsolete patterns? So for example, roads oriented towards now inactive mines, etc. One to Maisie. How should we think about mechanisms? Did KIP directly discourage formalization development through regulation, or do you see this as endogenous response by developers? So in other words, KIP raises slum quality and land value, which then raises costs for developers building formal structures. So let's start off with these 2, and then please raise your hands if you want to come in later.
So, Juliana, could you sort of clarify about you said roadblocks?
Yes, so the question is on historic roadblocks. Are they beneficial in itself, or could they be a constraint when they're driven by old obsolete patterns?
You mean roadblocks, roads that don't go anywhere, roads that that terminate and stuff like that. Is that really what you're focused on? I mean,
I think that was the question, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's a general system question here, or issue about roads in developing country cities that, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, there are very few limited access highways. And so mostly you have these old roads that are quite narrow, that don't necessarily go in, you have some roads going out of the city, for example, where you'll have a thoroughfare, but reconstructing the road network for a modern city is really a very tough part of this exercise. And so you think of it in a planning world, and this is in some sense the problem, the lack of planning. If you're redeveloping sections of the city, you would change the roads, and you would make them wider, you would make a better road system. Without that, you know, if you just privately redevelop, you've still got crowded roads and traffic congestion traveling through a city. I mean, you know, 11 a.m. in the morning and you're trying to cross Dar es Salaam or you're trying to cross Nairobi, it takes forever because the streets are just so crowded. So there is a coordination issue here. There is an issue of a limited public budget to spend on roads and to redesign roads, and an issue of lack of planning. Let me leave it there.
Okay, for me, I think the question was about mechanisms of KIP. That's a great question. Let me say it two ways. So I think the first is that in our model, there are formal reasons why KIP can delay formalization. So KIP could make informal areas more attractive because residents can live there longer. So the amenities for low types are better and that they want to stay there longer. Amenities for high types are worse or better in non-KIP. KIP can also have greater formalization costs. So those are the mechanisms in the model. Our paper is less focused on, trying to quantify the relative importance of the different channels. And so we focus more on running counterfactuals, trying to figure out what the welfare implications are. So I would encourage, further work on exploring the relative importance of the different mechanisms. We do use reduced form and data to try to explore some other potential channels that are, I think, more important and in the policy debate. So I think one is, for example, crowding, right? Did KIP cross crowding because the upgrades could attract people and then people are going to stay there longer. And then this can also cause those places to be crowded and then land assembly costs can be greater. We do see more crowding. We tried our best to look for historical data to examine, patterns of crowding. We can only say that those historical crowding to the extent that we can quantify them, they are not, fully explaining our results, but we cannot definitively quantify the role of KIP in causing crowding over time. So we leave that to further work. There is, of course, this verbal guarantee, which is just verbal, so we can't really, document it. But there could be this notion that, the verbal guarantee created this norm of tenure security and people were able to stay there longer. And then hence, we do read from historical documents that developers, when they're choosing, whether to develop or not, they do pay attention to the KIP boundaries. But more work is needed.
Great. Okay. I have a few other questions from the chat as well. So I think this one for Vernon. It's a question on land allocation. So in the development of greenfield areas, how must the land be allocated? Through the market or through government? So the question largely draws from the fact that the market may solely be driven by profit and might ignore critical considerations like space for school, parks, police stations, etc. So that's one for you, Vernon. And then for Maisie, there's one question on how to think about upgrading with formalization. So the student is asking if you could elaborate on what upgrading means in this context and why it doesn't necessarily go hand in hand with formalization, especially considering that you're measuring it through images. And associated question, is it because the upgrading focused on public spaces rather than private ones?
So let me start here on the greenfield development, and I'm going to talk about the work that we're doing in Tanzania, where this Tanzanian government has these big greenfield projects that it is administering. And what it does, or what it did historically, was sell the land with an allocation system that was tended to help disadvantaged groups and poorer people. Mostly those people resold the land to more middle-income people. And, so there was initial sales at a low price and then a lot of reselling afterwards at a higher price. Of course, the people who were allocated the land, if you were low income, at least you did get a profit, a price benefit, even if you didn't have the money and didn't want to self-build. What we see there in Tanzania is there are private developments that are formal. They're few and far between. I think it's an issue of financing. The other issue is that these developments are governed by regulations in Tanzania, minimum plot size regulations that traditionally were really ridiculous, like 400 square meters for a residential plot, which is really high, and most of the city of Dar es Salaam itself is in violation of that. Um, and so, you know, there's this trade-off in the government program that was the 20,000 plot project. You know, you design this layout, which is really appreciated. You have the road, so that part is all great. The problem is really twofold with them. One is that they tended to think people should have really big plots, and they oversupplied large plots. And those plots sell at a heavy discount, and they could have served a lot more people if they'd made the plots smaller. They would have reached deeper into the income distribution. The other thing is, of course, the great thing you think about planned areas and the government doing this is that they did set aside all this land for non-residential use, for you know, religious sites, for nursery schools, for parks, and all that kind of stuff. But if we look in these project areas and look 20 years later, a lot of these plots were never developed. The uses were never developed. And it's only when the areas become much more populated and there's a real demand by the local residents do we see these planned non-residential uses emerging. So I think, you know, the government provides the planning. They're going to lay out the system. They have the money, or they can borrow it. In the case of the Tanzanian government, the 20,000 K project, they borrowed and repaid the money almost immediately just from the initial sale. So it was very successful financially. The private developers just have a harder time. They don't have the money. They don't have the resources, and maybe you know, not the scale. In a richer country like Indonesia, you get a lot more private developments that are very successful. People prepay for their units, so the developer has enough money to develop the place. They get good reputations. That process seems to work, but in contexts where incomes are much lower, it seems hard.
I think this question about upgrading with formalization also is another great question. I guess I will say connect it back to, I think in our model or in the way we think about it, right? There's usually, when we go from informal to formal, there's just this huge friction, formalization costs, or you can think of it as what Vernon says is corrupt mess. So there's a lot of complications when you go from informal to formal. And for some reason, KIP places have greater degrees of this friction. So there is this formalization cost that we think is delaying formalization and keeping these places informal. I think this is another area. This is a nice thing about PhD courses. This is another area for more work, because if it would be nice to be able to see, like, if we did upgrading with titles, right? That's almost very close to sites and services, offering titles also. And in there are studies, right, that say if we do paving with titles, right, it does improve land values. It's just here, right, oftentimes in countries or cities that are considering upgrading, they just don't have the resources. And titling, you know, at large scale is also a mess, very hard to do. And so oftentimes the KIP, right, they had to do upgrading without titling. And it does contribute to greater friction and more like the greater likelihood of delayed formalization. Maybe I'll stop there, but I'm happy to talk more if there are more follow-up questions.
Great. Yeah, I think students today are a bit shy, so keep going through some of the questions that we have in the chat. Vernon, I think this one may be for you. So the lack of property rights on land tend to give rise to informal settlers in the city. What are some of the effective measures undertaken in developing countries to balance property rights enforcement and the welfare of people displaced due to the redevelopment of lands? And then I think, Maisie, there's another one for you. Did you compare the transportation network and congestion effects among KIPs and areas where slums were demolished? I imagine new areas after slums demolition have better transportation access, wider roads, etc., which impacts utility and creates externality.
So, yeah, displacement is obviously a hard issue. And when you redevelop an area, you take a slum and you redevelop it, then you are displacing a bunch of people, and there are papers that talk about the costs of that. It's not clear what the alternative is. All cities in the world have redeveloped. They have replaced their slums. I think of LSE, where I teach, across the street in 1900 was what the British called, at least at that time period, a slum. It was better than the slum pictures we showed you for Nairobi, but it was a slum, and by 1910, that area was gone. It was redeveloped into more formal sector housing, and people were displaced. I think the big issue with displacement programs is that people typically are not compensated, or their compensation is pretty inadequate. And so that they are then displaced from what for them was the best place to live, typically to the outskirts of the city, where they have much longer commutes and they suffer a welfare loss. And there's inadequate compensation for that, and maybe not a lot of thought about, well, if we've got a neighborhood in a slum area, can we move the neighborhood more or less to some degree intact in terms of the social relationships of the people, the human capital that's there, the kids and their friends, and can we plan this in some kind of scale? I think it's just much more haphazard. So it is an issue. I think that you are going to formalize these areas that are slums near the city center. The pressure in the land market is so great. You're not going to preserve them forever. You know, you can't imagine London still with those slums from 120 years ago next to LSE in the heart of the city. It's just unimaginable and would be a real detriment to the city. But how you do it and how you take care of lower income people that are displaced is a big political issue, and they don't have a lot of political power in many of these contexts, and that's the problem. So yeah, it's problematic. Let me stop there.
There was this question was about transportation network and congestion and its relations to KIP. We thought about this. So in our paper, we do have a very basic model of commuting, and we do have data on commuting patterns. But because we have a static model, we're not able to explore, for example, like when there is a redevelopment happening, then commuting patterns change, especially like we don't have a network of firms hiring. And so the pattern of where firms will locate, and then that might change. Labor demand will change, and then labor supply will change, and hence commuting will change. And then on top of that, if commuting technologies change in terms of transportation networks, that is all interesting, but we just didn't have the time and scope, and we ran out of steam. I think that a good place to start for a topic like that actually would be to look at this other paper we also wanted to write, but then didn't have time, is that slum upgrading was actually in Indonesia was actually, because the KIP program was quite successful in terms of its short-term, medium-term impacts, it was actually scaled up into a lot of other cities. So it would be helpful to actually explore upgrading in all of these other cities, because then you could study actually city level forces like congestion, transportation, another topic that's good to study.
Great. Okay, so we're almost out of time. We have 2 more minutes, so I have 2 more questions, and we'll wrap up around those. So Vernon, one question on whether there's a paper that compared the quality that planning has on the city and which elements in planning are essential for the increase in land value / density. So for example, is it the grid structure? Is it the planning of electricity itself? Is it the planning to reduce traffic, etc.? And then Maisie, quite a broad question, but is there a trade-off between high height buildings in developing countries and the poor facilities of the buildings. High-rising buildings are built in Addis Ababa, for example, but lacks facilities needed.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure which one I can, you want me to answer. In terms of, our assessment is, and first of all, there isn't a good paper on planning written by economists. It doesn't exist. I'm sorry. So what we have are these kind of, let's look at as we're doing, let's look at a greenfield development and try and see what people value about that. As far as we can tell, what they value is first of all, titling. That seems really important. And secondly, they value kind of having a layout where they have access through local roads to then a highway system that takes them into the city, or what, not limited access highways, but major paved roads that are then going to take them into the city. So they really value access to transportation and being able to move. And they value having this nice layout where things are kind of regular, and presumably it depends on how these services are provided. Yes, of course, they want to be on the grid. They want a septic system, or they would like central sewers. That's city like Dar es Salaam. You just don't really have that. So we just don't have good stuff that tells us that. And really breaking that down is a really important research topic, and I encourage you to do it.
I guess I will say, this book, yes, we don't have good paper. I agree with Vernon, and it's such an important topic. But I have found this book helpful, Order Without Design by Alan Berteau. That talks about planning and markets. So if you're interested, definitely recommend. Coming to my question about trade-off of high rise versus poor quality. Yeah, I think we want to think of it as holistically, right? Because I think the buildings are for people. People, especially high income people, I think care about having space to live. So high rises is helpful because it allows you to offer a lot of housing on a small piece of land. So densification is good. But of course, we don't want to compromise quality. And I think developers respond to market forces for luxury housing. And so in some markets, they especially if they have competition, they do respond to it. But yes, this is definitely an area that is understudied, developing. And I guess one area of study perhaps is this regulatory reform in India called RERA. Somebody also should study that, because that reform actually imposed more regulation standards and safety standards. So you don't just have high rises that are poor quality, but studying that would be helpful too.
I just might comment on the question was by somebody talking about Addis, and in Addis there really was a problem with the program that trying to revitalize the center and move people into these flats, big apartment buildings on the outskirts of the city, and there was really no organization for public services. It was left to the residents to try and come up with their local community group to try and improve public services, and it's been an issue with those projects.
Okay, thank you so much, Bo. Unfortunately, we're not at time. I need to close the discussion, but I wanted to say a huge thank you for both of our speakers today, and also to the audience for your questions. We look very much forward to seeing you next week for our lecture on transportation. But yeah, thanks so much, everyone, and see you next week.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye. Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.